Parents, what's the creepiest thing your child has ever said that still haunts you? My 5-year-old stepson often talks about a man dressed like a cowboy who speaks to him and stands over his bed at night. About 2 years ago, we were living in an apartment where strange things started happening. Objects would be moved from their places. The cats would panic late at night, and whispers and footsteps could be heard, most often when someone was alone. We tried to ignore it, but one night, things took a frightening turn. I was at work, and my girlfriend, now my wife, was home with our little boy. He was playing in the living room while she cooked in the kitchen. Suddenly, he ran in screaming and clung to her, shaking all over with a terrified grip, as if something had truly frightened him beyond words. After he finally calmed down, he told her that he had seen a pink goat man standing in front of the door. He described it as having the head of a goat and the body of a man, covered in dark hair, but with pink skin. The description alone unsettled her, but when she tried to set him down to check, he clung to her even tighter. He screamed, kicked, and dug his nails into her arms, desperate not to be put down. We moved out of that apartment not long after. I still think about that night, and whatever he saw. It terrified him so completely that I doubt he'll ever forget it. Story 2. This happened a few years ago. My son would have been around 7. A little backstory. My husband worked maintenance for an apartment complex and was often responsible for cleaning out units after deaths or evictions. Every so often, he'd bring home things people had left behind. One day, he found a beautiful cross and decided to keep it. We hung it by the back entryway. Within days, strange things started happening. Lights left on, items moved around, little things we brushed off at first. One night, after putting my son to bed, I heard him talking when he should have been asleep. As I went down the stairs to his room, the noise stopped abruptly. When I peeked in, he looked like he was sleeping. I turned to leave, but he suddenly sat up and asked, "Why are you letting the man keep me up?" I froze and said, "There's no one here, sweetheart. Go back to sleep." He pointed behind me and said, "Yes, there is. He's right there. He hasn't left. Can you take him with you?" I spun around, but the room was empty. For the next few weeks, it kept happening. The same time every night. Our dog started sitting by the back entryway, staring at the wall, sometimes barking at nothing. And the cross? It would often be turned upside down when we passed by. Eventually, we got rid of the cross. After that, everything went back to normal. Story 3. My son always loved binoculars, ever since he was old enough to hold them. He would sit and stare out through our back windows for an hour at a time, and it was a great way to keep him quiet. This became his little pastime well into his teens. It was a bit strange, but I didn't think much of it. When he was about 14, I was dusting around the room while he was peering outside with the binoculars again. Then he asked, "Who lives in that house across there, Mom?" "Mrs. Fulton." "Why?" I replied. "Because pretty much every day, for as long as I can remember, whenever the curtains are open, a man always sits in the same armchair in that bottom room, doing absolutely nothing but staring right back at me. He doesn't move at all. Ever. But I haven't seen him this week." I quietly left the room and didn't explain to him that Mrs. Fulton lived alone and that her husband had died of a heart attack in that very chair when my son was still a baby. I didn't sleep at all that night. My son's fascination with his binoculars ended almost immediately after that. Story 4. My child's Catholic school is over 100 years old. There's a basement beneath the gym that's used for storage. I was substituting once, and during recess, one of the kickballs went down the stairs. A little girl stood at the top, calling out, "Just throw it up to me." I walked over and asked who she was talking to. She replied, "That big man down the stairs." I went down, but no one was there, and it's the only way in. Later, I asked some of the other kids if they had ever seen the man. They said, "Yes, but Sister told us not to talk to him." When I asked them to describe Sister, they described a nun, but there haven't been nuns at the school in 40 years. Story 5. My 1-year-old daughter had a terrible flu that wouldn't let up last winter. I remember putting her tired, grouchy self to bed one night, and after a lot of tossing and turning, she finally went quiet. A little later, I was doing some light housework when I accidentally knocked over a glass and it shattered. I cringed, thinking I'd woken up my finally sleeping baby, and went upstairs to check on her. She was still out cold, so I softly kissed her forehead and smiled. But as I turned to leave her room, I heard a raspy voice say, "Mommy?" Drawn out and low, almost like a growl coming from right behind me. I turned around, and there she was, standing in her crib, swaying slightly, eyes wide open, arms hanging limp at her sides. I didn't sleep well that night. Story 6. I don't have kids of my own yet, but my little brother once did something that still creeps me out to this day. He was about 3 when it happened. My mom called from the bathroom, asking me to grab her a towel so she could keep an eye on my 2 little brothers playing in the tub. I grabbed one and walked in just as my 3-year-old brother, who usually spoke in that broken, adorable little kid way, suddenly sat up straight, cocked his head, and said in this perfectly clear, serious voice, "Look, Mom, I can't die." Then he crossed his arms over his chest and slid underwater. It took a second for me and my mom to react, but she yanked him out almost immediately. He'd inhaled some water and was crying, but he was okay. Fast forward a couple of years, we were replacing the trim in my little brother's room, which was right next to the bathroom. While tearing down the trim inside their closet, the one that backed up to my parents' room, we found something odd. An old penciled height chart on the wall, hidden under the wood. There was only one name written there, Alan. The marking stopped at the age of 5. The elderly woman who had sold us the house had mentioned more than once that she and her husband were the original owners, and that they had never had children. She'd sold the place to help care for her husband in assisted living. Curious, and a little unsettled, we did some digging. Thanks to the local library's newspaper archives, we eventually found an article from the 1950s about that same couple. They had had a child, a little boy named Alan. He had drowned in the bathtub, the same bathroom where my little brother had his strange "I can't die" moment years before. According to the report, his mother hadn't been supervising him when he stood up in the tub, slipped, and hit his head. After that, I refused to go anywhere near my parents' bathroom again. Story 7. I was tucking my 3-year-old son into bed the other night. We went through the usual round of "I love yous," and then he just stopped talking, completely silent, which is very unusual. I think he's been quiet maybe once since the larva stage. He laid his head on the pillow, face turned down a little, but rolled his eyes up to look at me. Without lifting his arm, he pointed one little finger toward the rocking chair in the corner of his room. "Mommy," he said softly, "before you leave, can you take the rocking chair out of my room so the man will leave me alone?" I swear all the color drained from my face. Then he kept going. "The man's name is Johnny. He's a bad man. He's mean. He doesn't talk because he doesn't have a mouth. He just sits there and stares at me." Needless to say, I did not sleep well that night, and the rocking chair is now in the garage. Story 8. I literally creep myself out with this story once or twice a month at work just to pass the time, and I've finally decided it's time to share it. Backstory. My father died in a car accident when I was 10 years old. Around that same time, my great-grandmother, a deeply devout Catholic, and my cousin, who was much less devout, also passed away within weeks of each other. My great-grandmother died of pneumonia, and my cousin was killed in a car accident. When my son was an infant, around 9 or 10 months old, he used to pull himself up in his crib, smiling and cooing at a picture of my cousin. I didn't think much of it at first. Babies are drawn to faces after all. But as he grew older, I began to notice that he would talk to the picture. When he was about 3 years old, he suddenly came storming out of his room one night and demanded that I make that man be quiet. When I asked what man he meant, he said, "You know Dustin, with the red hair? The man in the picture. He visits me at night, but I'm really tired and I want to sleep." "Make him be quiet, Mom. Please," he cried. We had never talked to my son about Dustin, so hearing him call out the name of my late cousin at just 3 years old sent chills down my spine. About a year later, we were getting him into his booster seat when my aunt started the car. Suddenly, he began screaming in sheer panic. "Don't turn the car on till I'm buckled. Don't do it, please don't do it. I don't want to get crunched." Trying to calm him, I asked what he meant by crunched. He looked at me and said, "That's how my Babu died. He was crunched by the car that night." I asked who Babu was, and he said, "My grandpa." Later, I looked it up. Babu means grandfather in Swahili. My father, who was from Nigeria and spoke Swahili, had died 13 years earlier, at night in a car accident where he was, quite literally, crushed by his own vehicle. Lastly, a couple of weeks ago, my aunt was driving my son home from the movies when he suddenly started crying. He said he didn't want his Gigi to die, that her heart hurt, and she was going to die if someone didn't help her. At that exact time, I was at my grandmother's house, standing behind a paramedic who was reading her EKG. She had gone pale and clutched her chest, so I had called 911. As they were loading her into the ambulance, my son arrived home and immediately insisted on going to the hospital with her. We got in the car, seatbelts fastened, of course, and drove to meet her there. After a few hours and several tests, the doctor told us she was going to be all right. My grandmother sighed in relief and said, "Oh, thank heaven. I knew Mom was watching out for me." Without missing a beat, my 6-year-old said, "I wouldn't count on that, Gigi. Eleanor is in hell with the rest of the hypocrites." Eleanor was my great-grandmother, the devout Catholic who died years ago. My son had never met her, and as far as I know, had never even heard her name. Story 9. When I was about 3, my mom was in the kitchen cooking dinner while I was in the living room chatting away. She figured I was talking to the TV, but when she came in, she saw the TV was off. She asked, "Who are you talking to?" I pointed at the wall and said, "That man." She frowned and asked, "What man?" I pointed again. That man, right there." She said, the hair on her arm stood straight up. I remember seeing scary faces in the corner of my bedroom at night, but I always thought it was just me being a silly kid afraid of the dark. Then, over Christmas break 2012, I'm 23 now, I was staying at my parents' house, and at about 1 in the morning, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I felt like someone was watching me. I was lying on the side of the bed nearest the corner where I used to see those scary faces, and when I opened my eyes, I found myself less than a foot away from a bearded man staring right at me. Needless to say, I was terrified. I jumped back in bed, but when I looked again, no one was there. I knew I wasn't dreaming, but after a while, I calmed down and convinced myself I must have imagined it. The next morning, I told my brother about the bearded man I had seen, and he said, "Oh, you saw the bearded man too?" I was shocked. My younger brother, who is 21, told me that for years he had seen the same bearded man standing in different spots around his bedroom, just watching. He had never mentioned it to me or anyone else before. Story 10. There's a huge cemetery in a neighboring city that I used to love visiting before I had kids. The Black Dahlia, among many, many others, is buried there. A few years ago, when my son was 3 and my daughter was 1, I decided on a whim one morning that we'd go there for a walk and have a picnic lunch. I told my husband about the plan, packed up lunch, the mom bag, the kids, and headed out the door. On the drive over, my son asked where we were going. I told him we were going to take a walk through a park and have a picnic. I did not tell him it was a cemetery. I didn't mention graves or that people who had passed away were buried there. Nothing at all. We got there and drove past the administrative buildings and the big water fountain near the entrance. Then, we started heading toward the upper part of the cemetery. Before reaching the top, I turned down a road that wound past some of the oldest graves. As we rounded a bend, my 3-year-old son suddenly said, "Mommy, do you see all the people?" The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. I asked, "What people?" And mind you, there wasn't a single living soul in sight. We hadn't passed anyone since we'd entered the grounds. He pointed toward the hill and said, "All the people on the hill waving at me." I looked. Nothing. Not a person. I took a deep breath and said, "No, buddy, I can't see the people. But just because Mommy can't see them doesn't mean they might not be there. Let's go have lunch somewhere else so we don't bother them." And then, I noped right out of there. I have no idea what my son may have been seeing, but just like I told him, just because I can't see something doesn't mean it isn't there. If he really did see people waving at him, people I couldn't see, I have no idea whether they were being friendly or something else entirely. And honestly, I didn't want to find out, so fuck that. And now, even thinking about it, I'm thoroughly creeped out. Story 11. First, I should say that I'm an atheist and generally skeptical about so-called ghost stories, but this is my experience and I still don't know what to make of it to this day. When I was a boy, in the 1970s, from about age 3 to age 8, we would spend 2 months each summer traveling up to New England with the coachman trailer hitched to the big green Lincoln. We stayed in the trailer at various campgrounds except when we visited Mrs. Starr on Cape Cod. And that one time, we stayed at her home. She lived near us in the D.C. area, but had a summer house on a quarter-mile of private beach right on the Cape. The house was enormous, at least 150 years old even back then, and had been in her husband's family for generations. Her children were grown, and she had been a widow since before I was born. But she kept a room upstairs for her grandchildren, and for my younger brother and me, filled with giant tinker toys and other fascinating things. When I was about 6, we stayed there overnight for the first time. That night, I remember being kissed goodnight by an older man with rough cheeks who smelled like my mother's father. That could have been a dream, but the next day, while my dad was out on the beach painting and my mom was downstairs with Mrs. Starr, my brother, 3 years younger than I, and I were playing when the door creaked open and I caught that same whiff of cologne again. I remember walking to the door, opening it and poking my head out. I saw an old man walk into another room. I walked over and looked in, and he smiled and pointed toward the closet. I went to the closet and found a box filled with old books and knickknacks, and tucked between the pages of one of the books were some papers and a photo of the man. I was confused because when I turned around, he was gone. I ran downstairs to my mom and Mrs. Starr, who were sitting and having tea or something like it. I told my mom that the man upstairs wanted me to bring this down to Mrs. Starr. They both looked puzzled and said there was no one else in the house. I insisted, and they asked what man I was talking about. My dad, maybe? No, I said. Him. I pointed to a photo on the shelf beside Mrs. Starr, of her and her late husband. Mrs. Starr became visibly upset, and my mom was embarrassed and told me that wasn't a nice thing to say since Mr. Starr had died before I was born. I insisted, and I took the papers and pictures from behind my back and handed them to Mrs. Starr, telling her that it was true, that he had asked me to bring them down to her. I remember Mrs. Starr gasping and turning pale, asking where I had found them, and then quickly leaving the room in tears. In later years, I learned that those were old photos of her and her husband, as well as one of their children who had died young, along with some missing financial papers that had long been thought lost. We never stayed there again, though we continued to visit each summer. Now, this account is a blend of my own memories and what my mother later told me, but the essential facts remain true. As an atheist, it makes me deeply uncomfortable, and I still have no rational explanation for it. It is what it is. Story 12. This one is about my cousin and something that happened when we were younger. I almost don't even want to type this out because every time I remember it, I get seriously creeped out. A bit of backstory. My aunt, uncle, and cousins lived in a very old 2-story building. They lived on the 2nd floor. The 1st floor was abandoned and in rough shape. No one lived there. At the back of the building, there was a porch that had never been finished. The enclosed staircase stopped about 8 feet above the ground, and the enclosure was completely sealed off so that no one could get in or out. I was about 4, and she must have been around 8 or 9. I was at her house, and we were in the family room, sometimes called the game room, sitting at a table playing either Connect 4 or Memory. There was a door in that room that led to the back porch and stairway I mentioned earlier. So there we were, playing our game, when there came a knock at that door. My cousin jumped up excited and ran to open it. Remember this part. I'll explain later. I can still, very clearly and vividly, remember what was on the other side of the door. There were 2 little girls. One shorter, who I assumed was younger, and one taller. Their hair was partly pinned up, with the ends curled, and they were dressed in what I can only describe now as old-fashioned and fancy. They wore fancy little girl dresses and small shoes, all white. I remember that clearly. Everything about them was white, except for their brown hair and their black eyes. I went from excited to terrified the instant I saw those eyes. I remember my cousin speaking to them very casually, saying something like, "Hi, I can't play right now. My cousin is here." And then shutting the door. She went right back to the table to continue our game, and I followed, sticking as close to her as I could. She didn't seem scared or even concerned, but I was absolutely terrified. The older I get, the more unsettling that memory becomes. I have other memories of seeing them too, always outside the apartment. My cousin gets visibly uncomfortable and denies everything whenever I try to ask her about it, so about that door. Fast forward about 10 years. I was probably in my teens when my dad finally decided, after much nagging on my part, to tell me some ghost stories. One of them involved that same back door, and it led to a frightening discovery. The door had been nailed shut. He told me he'd found it that way around the time I was an infant. I'm pretty sure I went pale when he said that. The realization made those early memories so much more terrifying. And then, about a year ago, I made the mistake of Googling something called the black-eyed children phenomenon. Reading those accounts only fueled my anxiety and has even triggered panic attacks whenever those memories resurface. Story 13. When my nephew was around 4 or 5 years old, he would often stand at the bottom of the stairs. We lived in Salem, in one of those old houses that had been split in half. People would rent out the large half and move the old servants' quarters downtown to be separate homes. We had the servants' half. We used to call what he did loitering, probably just to make it seem less creepy. I should also mention that my sweet nephew has a nonverbal learning disability, which he's overcome by leaps and bounds. And at that time, he didn't speak at all. He never knew his grandfather. We didn't really talk about him. His nickname was Po-Pop. One day, my nephew stood at the bottom of the stairs again. His mother, a boisterous English woman, walked over and said, "For the love of Jiminy Cole, what on earth is so fascinating?" He pointed up the stairs, and then stared straight into my sister's eyes, completely unblinking. And then he spoke a single word: Po-Pop. No one slept that night. It felt like something straight out of The Shining. He still stares up those stairs from time to time. Story 14. When I was a kid, Mr. Rand used to come into my room 4 or 5 times a week. He'd talk to me and tell me about things like how he was killed in the Second World War. Old Mate Rand was, of course, a figment of my 4-year-old imagination. Anyway, one day when I was about 9, Mr. Rand stopped showing up. Fast forward to about 3 years ago. My son, who was around 5 at the time, came out of his room one night at about 11:30 and said there was a man in his room. I panicked, ran in, and found nobody there. Then my son said, "Mr. Rand said you can't see him anymore, but he's okay." Now, my kid's got his own imaginary friend named Mr. Rand, but they only talk once or twice a year. Story 15. A friend of mine was 6 years old when she told her mother, "The lady who used to live here told me she hates the wallpaper, and you're covering her note." Her mom assumed it was just a child's imagination and forgot about it. 12 years later, while redecorating and peeling off the attic wallpaper, the mom found a suicide note scratched into the wall. Horrified, she called my friend in tears, asking if she remembered anything else about the woman who had spoken to her. My friend began to recall the woman and then started to panic, realizing she had only ever spoken to her while in the attic. Story 16. I work in a preschool, and creepy things get said and done all the time. But one moment from last year still stands out. There's a small kitchenette area in our classroom where the kids play house during free time. One little girl, who tended to keep to herself, caught my attention. I watched as she gently rocked a baby doll back and forth, softly singing to it. Then, without warning, she shoved the doll into the play oven, slammed the door, turned to me, and said in the creepiest little voice, "Sometimes bad babies go in timeout." Then she smiled and ran off. That one really shook me. Edit. A lot of people have since messaged me suggesting I should keep an eye on her parents or that she might be abused. I truly appreciate the concern, it's very kind, but I can assure you that wasn't the issue. She just likes saying shocking things to get a reaction, which is actually pretty common for kids. This was just an especially unsettling example. Story 17. When I was about 2 years old, my grandmother was in the hospital dying of cancer. I was too young to understand what was happening. One day, while my mother and aunt were watching me, I suddenly looked at them and said, "Only one grandma." They tried to correct me, gently insisting that I had 2 grandmothers, but I just kept repeating, "Only one grandma." Then the phone rang. It was my uncle calling to tell my mother that my grandmother had passed away just a few minutes earlier. Story 18. My mom's dad died 10 years before I was born. When I was about 6 or 7, my parents were getting divorced. The day before my mom told me about it, I was sitting at the kitchen table drawing while she was cooking dinner. She says I suddenly stopped what I was doing and turned toward the front door. staring for a while as if someone had come in. Then I giggled, looked back at her and said, "Granddad says don't worry. Everything will be okay, and he won't let anything bad happen." After that, I started humming and went right back to my drawing. My mom says it was the single creepiest thing that's ever happened to her. I don't remember any of it. Story 19. When my son was little, maybe 3, he used to crawl in this strange way, sliding his forehead along the floor. That alone was pretty creepy. Then one night, he crawled across the hallway into my room like that, stood just a few inches from my face, and made a weird meowing sound. He climbed into bed with me and went to sleep. Another time, he was terrified about a monster in the basement. We went down, found nothing, of course, and as I turned off the light and started back upstairs, he said, "He's right behind us now." I might have peed a little. But the creepiest thing he ever did was after I scolded him for misbehaving. He hid his head under his blanket, so I pretended to look for him, saying, "Where is my little Carson?" Slowly, he lowered the blanket, stared at me with this dead, chilling expression, and said, "Carson is gone. I am Rick. I'm convinced he was possessed. We never knew any Ricks, still don't. Never figured out where he got that name." Story 20. When I was about 5, my dad's cousin shot his 7-year-old son and then himself. His wife had filed for divorce and wanted custody of their boy, and he just lost it. After that happened, my dad and his brothers had to clean out their cousin's house. Since I was the youngest, everyone thought, "Oh, Jess should get the dead child's toys. That's great." So I ended up with one of those little Tykes outdoor play castles. You know, the plastic ones shaped like a tiny fortress where you could sit inside. It was actually a really cool fort. Anyway, one day I was sitting inside the tower part and my mom was out on the deck when she heard me talking to myself. She came over and asked who I was talking to this time. I had quite a few imaginary friends. I told her I was talking to the little boy whose castle it was, and that I told him not to cry because my mommy could be his mommy. My mom promptly had my dad throw the castle out. Edit. Here's another fun part of the story. When my dad was packing the boy's stuffed animals and other things into his truck to take for donation, he heard a little boy's voice say, "What are you doing with my toys?" Now, my dad is the manliest man I've ever met, but he said he got seriously freaked out by how clear the voice was. You'd think that would have been a good sign not to give me any of his toys. Story 21. My 3-year-old nephew was at my cottage. He's asked me several times about the girl over there, always pointing toward one of the back bedrooms. The place is small, and there's definitely nobody there, so I just dismissed it as an act of imagination. He has lots of imaginary friends. Then, some friends came to visit, and they brought their daughter, who's about the same age. She had never met my nephew. Twice, in one day, she asked about the pretty girl, pointing to the exact same room. That definitely caught me off guard, and I didn't know what to think. At Christmas, my family came over to my place, and my nephew pointed at a picture of my wife and asked if she was coming to visit us here, or if she just stayed at the cottage. My wife died 10 years ago. I don't really believe in paranormal stuff. It's probably just my logical brain trying to make sense of a few kids' ramblings. But it definitely got my attention. Story 22. A few months ago, my 3-year-old daughter had the flu. After she started feeling a bit better, my wife took her outside to play in our backyard. My wife was sitting on the back step when my daughter came over and asked if she could play with the little girl on our slide. My wife said, "I don't see a little girl." And my daughter replied, "She's right over there on the slide, Mom. Can't I play with her?" My wife repeated that she didn't see anyone, but my daughter insisted, "She's on the slide, and she's blue. Can I play with her?" Now, thoroughly unsettled, my wife told her, "Let's go inside and make a snack." So they did. For the rest of the day, though, my daughter kept going to the back door, telling my wife that the little blue girl was lonely. Story 23. I'm not a parent myself, but a friend of mine has a 4-year-old son who lives with his mother. They're separated. When the boy was nearly 4, one of his mother's housemates had a litter of puppies and was trying to find homes for them. One day, the boy put one of the puppies in the front-loading washing machine along with some laundry and somehow managed to start a spin cycle. He then went back to his room across the hall to play. My friend, the boy's dad, happened to be visiting and heard the machine running. When he went to check, he saw what had happened. Wanting to spare his son from being traumatized, He quickly removed the puppy's body before the boy could see. But as he walked past the doorway, his son came out, looked into the laundry room, and asked, "Where is that dead puppy, Daddy?" It's quite possibly the creepiest thing I've ever heard a kid say or do. Apart from that one incident, he's always been a completely normal little boy. Story 24. A good friend of mine and her husband bought what would be considered an old house around here. In Western Canada, that means anything close to 100 years old. They were renovating the basement one day while I was visiting. I was down there alone with their son, who was barely 2 at the time and couldn't yet speak in full sentences. He took my hand and led me over to a brick, chimney-like structure with a small, rusty metal door on it. He looked up and said, "That's where the dead babies go." I was horrified. The kid could barely talk, let alone say something like that. I doubt he even knew what dead meant. I'm certain no one would have told him that, and there weren't any older kids around who might have said it as a joke. It still creeps me out to this day. Story 25. I have a younger brother who had an imaginary friend when he was little. He was also an avid sleepwalker. When he was around 3 or 4, he started talking to someone he called Fria, pronounced Fria. He described Fria as a dark-skinned man who wore very little clothing and loved to hunt in the wilderness. One day, he told me that Fria used to live near our house a long time ago, until some white people came, burned him alive, and destroyed his village. Not exactly something you expect to hear from a 4-year-old. I remember being in my room and hearing him talking like he was having a full conversation. But every time I tried to check on him, he would go completely silent and slowly turn his head as soon as I peeked around the corner. Very unsettling. My other brother, the middle child, was visiting his dad for the summer. But the day before he got back, my youngest brother told my mother and me, "Fria doesn't like when brother is mean to me. He's going to scare him." The night he came home, my mom and I were downstairs when we suddenly heard a scream. One I can still hear to this day. We ran upstairs and found my middle brother terrified, swearing that someone had been shaking his bed violently. It was a bunk bed. My youngest brother, sleeping on the bottom bunk, was sound asleep. A month later, my youngest brother had a bad fall and cracked his skull. He was fine, but he never talked to Fria again after that. He kept sleepwalking, though. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find him standing right next to my bed just staring at me until I woke up, and, honestly, scared the life out of myself. One night, I heard the front door open and close. Since it was around 4 in the morning, I went to check it out. When I opened the door, I saw my brother at the far end of the yard standing in the snow wearing nothing but his underwear, staring straight at me. Then he slowly waved. Those shivers weren't from the cold. Story 26. My boss had 2 daughters, one of whom passed away very young due to a medical condition. She died in her early 20s. The family found it easier not to keep pictures of her around or talk about her much. It was simply their way of mourning. The other sister eventually had 5 children. One of her little girls, at a very young age, often talked about playing with her imaginary friend named Lisa, which happened to be the name of the deceased sister. No one thought much of it at first until one day the little girl mentioned that her friend was her aunt and that she visited her quite often. The unsettling part was that the child had never been told she had an aunt, let alone her name. I'm close to the family, and when I heard that story, it gave me chills. Story 27. We had just moved into a new house. My daughter's room has a closet down a narrow little hallway. About a week after we'd settled in, I woke up one morning and noticed she wasn't in her bed. No big deal. I figured she was downstairs, but she wasn't. I searched the whole house. Nothing. Finally, I went back to her room and called out, "Are you in here?" "Don't come in here," came the reply from the closet. I walked over and looked down the narrow hallway but couldn't see her. She was inside and off to the left. "Don't come in here. Please, come out. Don't look at me. What are you doing in there, Caitlin?" "I'm not Caitlin." I noped right out of there for a second because, honestly, that freaked me out. I went and got my wife out of bed. She came in to check, opened the closet, and found our daughter inside, putting on a strawberry shortcake costume to surprise me, and didn't want me to see it before she was ready. Scared me half to death. Story 28. About a year ago, my daughter, who was about 3 years old at the time, started screaming around 2 in the morning. I could tell by the sound of her voice that something wasn't right. Still half asleep, I rushed down the hall into her room without turning on the lights so I wouldn't wake her brother. I could hear her screaming like crazy right in front of me, but when I pulled back the covers, she wasn't there. My brain could barely process what was happening. I could hear her right in front of me, but she clearly wasn't in the bed. I turned on the light, but still couldn't see her anywhere. Meanwhile, she was getting even more terrified because she could hear me, and knew I couldn't find her either. After what felt like minutes, I finally realized she had rolled out of bed and gotten stuck underneath it. She was screaming because she couldn't move and had no idea where she was. I'll never forget that feeling of pure panic, hearing her scream from what sounded like the bed, only to pull back the covers and find it empty. Story 29. This isn't about me, but I used to go to a family-run comic book shop owned by a good friend of mine. He had a few kids. The oldest was about 5 or 6 at the time. A few of us had just helped move the shop to a new location in the historical part of the city. While we were putting some things away in the finished basement, we noticed a door that led to an unfinished tunnel. It stretched on for quite a distance, old, dark, and creepy, with only a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. My friend's son looked at the tunnel and said, "That's where the ghosts live." His father laughed and said, "There are no ghosts in there." The boy just looked at him, completely serious, and replied, "They're in there. You just can't see them." My friend and I exchanged a nervous chuckle, but neither of us felt much like going near that tunnel again. Story 30. My son is autistic, and while not nonverbal, he's not great at back and forth conversation. We'd just moved into a new place, and I'd started noticing strange things, mostly in his room. One evening, at twilight, I was cooking when I realized he'd gone completely quiet. I walked to his room and found him crouched by the window, trembling like he couldn't move. I knelt down and asked, "What's wrong, baby?" "I'm scared," he said. "Why are you scared?" He comes in through the cold, dark window. As I glanced toward the window, he turned to me and whispered, "No, Mama. He's mean." It was maybe the 3rd time he had ever called me Mama. It sent a chill straight through me. A month later, my husband, who was convinced it was all nothing, decided to put our son to bed in his own room again. I was outside talking to a friend when I saw a flash from his phone through the window. A moment later, he came out looking pale. When I asked what happened, he showed me the picture he'd taken, and there was a man standing over our son, staring directly at my husband through the camera. I asked, "Why did you take the picture?" He said, "Because I felt someone looking at me." Story 31. I had to make an account just to share this. My son had been complaining about a man who wouldn't let him sleep in his room. He said the man slept in his closet. I brushed it off as his imagination, comforted him back to sleep, and didn't think much of it. A little later, I was babysitting my friend's 18-month-old daughter, an incredibly bright kid, and she wandered into my son's room to play. When I went to check on her, she was sitting in the corner, facing the wall, giggling and talking. It was strange, but she was a baby, so I didn't think anything of it. Then, another night, my son woke up screaming. He told me he couldn't sleep with him in here, pointing toward his closet. As he said it, the closet door slammed shut. It was the scariest thing I've ever experienced. I grabbed my son, got out of the room, and shut the door behind us. Needless to say, we moved out soon after. Edit. There was plenty of other weird stuff that happened in that apartment, but this was the straw that broke the camel's back. Story 32. When my oldest daughter was about 2, she used to wake up screaming in the middle of the night. She told my wife and me it was because she was visited by a lady. A few weeks later, the screaming stopped. Casually, I asked if the lady had gone away. She said, "No, she's just nice now. Her name is Shelia. She sleeps in my bed sometimes." A year later, our youngest daughter turned 2 and started having the same nighttime screaming fits. When we asked her about it, she described the same lady. The same name, Shelia. Fast forward 3 years. We had never mentioned any of this again. We figured it was just a mix of active imaginations and sibling storytelling. It hadn't come up in at least 2 years. Then we moved to a new house with our 3 kids, including our 2.5-year-old son. On the very first night, as we were tucking him in, he looked up and asked, "Where will Shelia sleep now?" Story 33. I used to live in South Texas on a small Navy base in Flower Bluff. My two young boys back then used to wake my wife and me up all the time, claiming they'd seen or heard all sorts of paranormal stuff. I won't lie. The place was creepy as all hell. Then we started finding glasses of water sitting around the house, all with different amounts in them. Nobody could explain it. Finally, I asked my oldest about it, and he said it was my younger son's thing because he was helping a friend. So, my wife and I asked him, "What's with the glasses?" He told us, perfectly calm, "I leave them out for the black man. He doesn't want to spit all his water on our floor." My wife asked, "Black man? Like a shadow?" He shook his head. "No. Black like my friend from school. But when he tries to talk, he just coughs and spits up water." Pretty freaky to hear that from a 4-year-old. Fast forward a few years, and we're having a family discussion, reminiscing about the haunted house. My sons had done a bit of research on the area. Turns out there was a massive hurricane that hit in 1900, the worst the U.S. had ever seen, until Hurricane Andrew struck Florida. Thousands of people died, most from drowning. Not long after, the government bought the land, cleaned it up, and it eventually became NAS Flower Bluff. My younger son still remembers seeing what he called the water ghost. He says if he were a better artist, he could draw the man as easily as he could draw any of us. My older son says he mostly remembers the noises, the footsteps, the thumps, the sounds that wouldn't stop no matter how many times he told them to. We all saw shadow figures at one point or another, and the boys told us later that kids on their school bus used to talk about seeing the same kinds of things. Apparently, it was a pretty common topic among the neighborhood kids. Story 34. I'm not a parent, and this isn't something I said that creeped my parents out, but it's still a story that gives me chills whenever I think about it. When I was about 5 or 6, I couldn't sleep one night. I had this awful feeling that something was wrong. I stood on my bed and looked out the window, and there was a man standing behind a bush in our back garden. I screamed for my parents. My mom ran upstairs. She'd been watching TV with my dad, and I told her there was a man outside. She said I'd just had a bad dream. I begged her to look, but she didn't see anyone. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I looked again, and the man was still there. I ran downstairs trying to convince my parents, but they didn't believe me. I told them I wasn't going back upstairs until we knew for sure there wasn't anyone out there. My dad finally sighed and said he'd check. As he reached for the back door, there was a knock at the front door. It was a policeman. He said he'd received a call from our house. Someone had reported a man in the garden. This was before anyone had mobile phones. The officer searched the garden and found the man hiding behind the bush. To this day, we still have no idea who made that phone call. The police said it came from our landline, but none of us ever touched the phone. Story 35. My dad spent most weekends and afternoons after school with his grandmother, my great-grandmother, in a big old house in Southern California. She passed away only a few weeks after the house was sold in the early 1960s, before she had a chance to settle anywhere else. When I was about 12, more than 30 years later, we happened to be visiting friends in the area, and my dad looked up the current owners to see if they would mind us stopping by. It turned out their parents had bought the house from my great-grandmother, and they were very happy to have us visit. As we walked through the house, my dad pointed out what had stayed the same and what had changed. The woman showing us around, friendly and warm at first, began giving us curious looks. Finally, she couldn't hold back any longer and said, "I know this sounds strange, but..." Then she started telling us all these things. Every radio in the house, no matter what they did, would only play my great-grandmother's favorite classical music station. Always. Nearly every time they left the house, they'd return to find it on. And everything they planted in the flower box beneath the kitchen window would die, no matter what they tried. But poppies always grew there instead, blooming all year round. My great-grandmother's favorite flowers? Poppies. She always had them in that very box. Their kids often talked about the nice old lady in the sunroom, which happened to be my great-grandma's favorite room. More than once, the woman who lived there told us she was certain she'd heard an old woman singing in that room during the late afternoon, just as my great-grandma used to do while my dad played nearby and she sewed. Then one day, their 6-year-old son came home from school, saw me, and ran straight up to me, grinning. "Have you come to visit the old lady?" he asked. "She'll be so happy. She talks about you all the time." Then he turned to my dad, and here's the part that made everyone stop cold. He called my dad by name. Story 36. I have a 4-year-old daughter now, but she was about a year and a half old when this happened. She was just starting to talk. Not a lot, but clear enough that we could understand what she meant. Ever since she was born, she's been incredibly attached to her grandpa, my dad. Whenever we visited my parents, she never wanted to leave. One Sunday, when it was time to go home, she threw a huge tantrum, crying the whole ride back. When we got home, it was just the two of us. And I'll admit, I lost my patience. I started raising my voice, telling her we couldn't be at her grandparents' house all the time, that we had our own home and we had to live in it. In the middle of her sobbing, she suddenly stopped, looked me right in the eye and said, clear as day, "No, you don't yell at me. I am your grandmother. I miss my son." My grandmother had died a few years before my daughter was born. A little backstory. My grandmother always told me that we were soulmates, that we'd met in many other lives and would keep finding each other in the ones to come. When she was close to the end, she told me not to mourn her. She said, "We'll meet again. Next time, I'm going to be your daughter, so you take care of me this time around." Even now, thinking about that still gives me chills. Story 37. This one was a little strange for me. My cousin was almost 2 and was being babysat at my place. She was obsessed with this little Jamaican flag magnet I'd brought back from a vacation, always asking me to lift her up so she could get a closer look at it on the fridge. So I picked her up for a bit, let her look, and then set her down. She toddled off into the living room while I put on some cartoons. When I went back to the kitchen a few minutes later, the magnet was gone. I looked everywhere, on the floor, under the fridge, even in the living room in case I'd accidentally kicked it in there. Nothing. While I was looking, my cousin, still staring at the TV, asked, "What doing?" I said, "I can't find the magnet." Without looking away, she said, "He put it up. Up." I froze. "Who's he?" She pointed toward an empty corner of the living room and said again, "He." Yeah, that freaked me out. Fast forward a few weeks later. I'd completely forgotten about the whole thing. One morning, I went to grab a cereal box from the top of the fridge, and what fell down with it? The magnet. Story 38. I know this will probably get buried, but this one still creeps me out. One night, around 11, I heard my 5-year-old daughter crying in her room. She'd been asleep for hours, so I went in, gave her a hug, and asked what was wrong. Through tears, she said, "Mommy, I dreamt you were eaten by the same thing that ate your mom and her sister, and you died." I froze. She was barely 5 at the time, and I had never talked to her about my mother or how she died. She never even met her. She'd only met my aunt once when she was very young, and she knew she'd passed away, but not how. Both my mom and my aunt died from the same aggressive, fast-moving cancer, the kind that, for lack of a better word, ate them alive. Yeah, creepy as hell. And for what it's worth, I really, really hope she's wrong. Story 39. When my son was just learning to talk, he started mentioning a man he would see, sometimes in our entryway, other times outside his bedroom window. The thing is, our windows have full shutters, with only a small decorative half circle of glass at the top. And that's where he said the face always appeared, up in that half circle, far too high for any real person to be looking in. One night, around 1 in the morning, he woke up and started tracking something with his eyes and finger, following it slowly through the room. Then he pointed toward my bedroom and told my mom. It went into Mama's room. He even once said the man was outside our car when we were away from home. Eventually, he stopped mentioning it. But not long after, when my daughter started walking, she began saying similar things, and she would run past the entryway, like her life depended on it, eyes wide with terror. They don't see it anymore, but I still get chills thinking about it. That thing, whatever it was, creeped me the hell out. Story 40. Our son was about 3 when he started talking about the boy in the bathroom. Sometimes he'd stop playing mid-game, look toward the hallway and say, "Did you hear that?" Then he'd run off to the bathroom, insisting, "The boy in the bathroom keeps crying. We have to help him." Other times we'd hear him say, "Oh, it's okay. He's laughing now." or we'd catch him standing in there whispering to someone we couldn't see. It was creepy enough that he clearly believed this boy was real. But what really got us were the friends who came over and asked, completely unprompted, about our son upstairs laughing his head off. Except he hadn't even been home at the time. Eventually, the talk about the boy stopped. Months went by without a single mention. Then one afternoon, completely out of the blue, my son walked up to me and said, "The boy in the bathroom is a monster." I asked him what made him say that. He looked at me and said, "He has horns and sand comes out of his mouth. He said he lives with his friends in volcanoes." Yeah, freaky doesn't even begin to cover it. Story 41. When I was a kid, I had an imaginary friend who used to follow me everywhere. He was like my shadow, except he wasn't attached to me. Sometimes I'd chase him through the house and he'd fade into a closet or disappear around a corner. As I got older, I stopped seeing him. But people who visited my home said they sometimes saw a shadow that wasn't connected to anyone, both inside and outside the house. When I was about 9, my family was heading out early one morning, around 4 a.m. As I walked to the car, I saw a man standing in the space between our house and the garage. Without saying a word, I just followed him into the dark. My parents, confused, came after me and found nothing. Later, when I described the man to them, they went pale. 16 hours later, we got the call. My estranged uncle had died. The man I described looked exactly like him. During a nighttime walk from one family member's home to another, deep in the countryside, where the darkness is so complete you can barely see your hand and the thick canopy hides the sky, my mother and I were approached by an old man. Strangely, he was clearly visible, despite the blackness. As we drew nearer, my mother's unease turned to panic. She grabbed me and pulled me back toward our relative's house. The figure we had seen was the likeness of a long-dead family member, dressed exactly as he had been at the time of his death. My mother has always sensed when something is wrong. She has urged people to visit their loved ones just hours before they passed, once even insisting my father visit his father after several weeks in the hospital. More than once, she has awakened in the night to announce that a family member has died, moments before the phone rang with the news. When my sister and I were children, we both heard what can only be described as unearthly, beautiful singing in the night, each time followed by news that someone close to us had died. Friends who stayed at our house often refused to return, saying they awoke to see a man watching them through the window. Once, as a child, I lost my temper and shouted at whatever presence caused these strange events, demanding that it stop. That same night, my entire family woke to the sound of a woman weeping somewhere in the house. Animals, too, have behaved unnaturally around me. Some have refused to die, or seemed not to stay dead, which has been deeply disturbing and, at times, truly traumatic. Story 42. Early one morning, when my daughter was 4 years old, I was awakened by her shouting, "Stop it, John! You're scaring me!" There was real distress in her voice, and more alarming, there were only the two of us in the house. I leaped out of bed, and in just a few wide steps, was across the hall and shoving open her bedroom door. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed and looked startled by my sudden entrance. I quickly glanced around the room but didn't see anything unusual. Trying to keep my voice calm, I asked, "What are you up to?" She said, "I was just talking to Johnny. He came in to play, but I don't want to today." Thinking she was just imagining things, I asked who Johnny was. She gave me this look, almost pitying, and said, "This was Johnny's room before he got hit by a car." Story 43. I was staying at an old friend's house in the countryside, a tiny hamlet in the middle of nowhere. The family had an old German shepherd that had been with them for about 10 years and had slept in the youngest daughter's room ever since she was born. She was about 5 or 6 the night I stayed over. Sometime after 2 in the morning, the dog suddenly started barking. And I mean absolutely bellowing, and wouldn't stop. Naturally, the father rushed into the room, found nothing unusual, and after talking briefly to his daughter, picked her up and carried her to his own room, where she spent the rest of the night. In the morning, I asked what had happened and why the dog had barked so much. The little girl looked up at me with the eeriest expression I've ever seen on a child and said, "Because the old woman at the foot of my bed wouldn't stop screaming." Eat it. Later, the family asked about the previous owner of the house and were told it had belonged to an old woman who had been found dead in that very bedroom. Story 44. Okay, Rule Breaker McGee here, but I figure I'll share the creepiest thing I apparently ever did or said to my parents. Now, I have no real memory of this. The only reason I believe it happened is because of how sincerely my parents have told the story over the years, both to me and to others. It's been a few years since I last heard it from them, so forgive any missing details. When I was around 3 or 4, I started talking to my parents about my other family. One of my older siblings had imaginary friends at the same age, so at first they thought it was the same sort of thing, especially since I often talked about a little girl. For a few weeks, they mostly ignored it, assuming it was harmless imagination. But then I started mentioning a man and a woman too. That's when my mom realized something was off, because when I talked about the little girl, I always used the past tense. With my siblings' imaginary friends, and most kids really, the imaginary person is there, and everything happens in the present tense. But I was always talking about what the little girl and I had done. This, combined with the sudden introduction of the man and woman, soon to be revealed as my other mother and father, made my parents start paying closer attention to what I was saying. After weeks of brushing off my imaginary companions, they finally began to ask questions. When my mom first asked, "Who are you talking about?" I looked at her with what she later described as a level of seriousness completely inappropriate for a child and said, "My other family." Apparently, I had a whole catalog of stories about them. One that stood out to my dad happened the first time he took me to the beach. He asked if I was excited to see the sea for the first time, and I told him I wasn't, because I'd already been there with my other family. He said I was totally unimpressed, which threw him since it was a 4-hour round trip just to get there. What really unsettled him, though, was how serious I was about it. Not grumpy or bratty, just eerily matter-of-fact. He told me later it was like my personality completely shifted whenever I talked about them, as if I was remembering something real. Everything I said, every strange story, always came back to my other family and the things I had already done with them. After plenty more mentions of my other family, my parents finally decided to sit me down and have a proper talk about what on earth I was going on about. They took me into the pantry-turned-playroom and asked me directly. Up until then, whenever they'd ask questions, I'd apparently gone quiet or changed the subject. But this time was different. They asked if I could see my other daddy, mommy, or sister. I said no. They asked if they had ever been here, in our house. I said no. They asked where I saw them and when. I whispered, "Before." Then I hopped down from the chair and went right back to playing with my Legos like the conversation had never happened. Sitting behind me, my dad asked, "Where did they go?" Without looking up, I moved my hands in little digging motions and said, "Down, down into the hole in the ground." So there my parents were, sitting with their 4-year-old child, who was now calmly talking about having been at the funeral of his other family. The conversation stopped cold. I went back to my Legos. My parents just looked at each other in silence. Then my dad, trying to keep his voice steady, asked, "Where did they go down into a hole?" My answer, "Granddad's house." That was enough for him. He grabbed the car keys and off we went. Destination, Granddad's house. Objective, get some answers about the creepy kid's story. But when we got there, it turned out I wasn't talking about my granddad's house at all. I was talking about a graveyard about 10 minutes down the road, a place my parents had never taken me, a place my grandfather swore he'd never taken me, and somewhere I could not possibly have gone on my own. Still, I led the 3 of them, my mom, dad, and grandfather, straight through the cemetery without hesitation, right to a weathered limestone grave marker about 3/4 of the way to the back. I stopped, pointed to the ground in front of it, looked up at them, and said, "In there." After that day, I never mentioned my other family again. My parents never brought it up either. Not until I was in my early teens when they cautiously asked, "Do you remember doing this?" For context, the graveyard I led them to was officially designated as a burial ground in the 1200s, according to the local history I've read since. There are people buried there ranging from famine victims to World War I veterans. Aside from the war graves, there hadn't been a burial there since the 1800s. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.